All right, so we have a small but mighty group of participants today. We want to make sure that we are sharing this with you to get your feedback because we are just starting this work as something that we will be doing regularly next year. So are going to ask for your feedback in a survey at the end. We really appreciate your candor and your constructive feedback so that we can make sure to make this the best possible situation for everyone for next year. This is our second of 3 pilot sessions. The first session that we did was how to use lessons, Quill lessons. This session is focused on ways that you can support your students in using Quill as more independent learners and transferring the skills they learn from Quill to their own work. And this session will also be here to support you with just figuring out exactly what it may look like on your end to make sure students are prepared to do the work. And beyond that, next week we will be focusing on thinking about how Quill can fit into your curriculum over the course of the whole year. We will be lucky to be working with our curriculum director on that one, so you'll get some really good ideas about not only how to do that, but also what's coming for Quill. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get right into it. All right, so Zoom, we've just gone over it. Your videos and microphones will be off. If you have any questions, you could put them in the chat. Look for the to everyone. And then any general question you have that's not related to what we're working on in this webinar so far, you're welcome to toss that into questions and we'll answer it at the end of the webinar. So we'll be talking for about the next 25 minutes, and then we're going to pause the talking and just do Q&A. Okay, so the big question for today's session is how can students use Quill effectively? Now, there are 2 things about Quill that are important to know. I'm a former instructional technology coach, and I can tell you from personal experience that no digital tool works in a vacuum, as I'm sure you've noticed as a teacher. It's really, really important for us to make sure that students are continuing to use Quill offline, and not actually, obviously, the Quill platform, but the skills that they are learning on Quill. It's important to us, as my colleague Donald says, that students are good writers and not just good at Quill. So we'll talk through how to do that today. There are a few things we'll talk through on Quill specifically about how students can track their progress, how they can use activities effectively, and how they can improve the work that they're completing on Quill. Beyond Quill, we'll talk through some ways that students can track those skills and strategies. One of the nice ways to get students to really internalize skills is just to step off of a platform, and it could be into a Google document if you use Google. It could be into a writer's notebook or onto a sheet of loose leaf in their binder, however it is that works best for you. And we'll talk a little bit about how you can support students in actually applying these strategies and skills they learn while working on sentences in Quill to go ahead and improve their writing overall. All right, so the first thing here is we're actually going to jump onto the student platform and talk through how to launch activities, how students can use those. Now, the most important message that I share with students overall is to go for green. When we talk about going for green, what we mean is students are aiming to get a green icon next to each activity they complete. Green on Quill means 80% or higher, and we consider that mastery. So our goal for students is to get 80% or higher on each of the activities that they practice so that they can show and build their mastery. We'll talk a little bit about how students can go back and redo work once they're not, if they haven't done it the first time, but obviously we want them aiming for that green the first time. The next thing here is one of the things that we know is common among students when they're using a digital tool is they don't necessarily do the reading, right? I was a middle school teacher, and the number of times that I got to walk over and stand by a student and say, "Can you read that aloud to me?" And halfway through the sentence, they went, "Oh, is far more than I can count." So one of the things that we'll talk you through is how you can lead students through this lesson to show them where the text shows up, where the hints are, what feedback they can read, etc., to make sure that they're following through. And then the last thing is to get students to check the report. Now, the Quill reports for how students have done and completed an activity show up just right at the end of the activity. So we're going to talk to you a little bit, and we're going to share a guide with you on screenshotting those in case students want to save those reports to be able to look at when they go to attempt the activity again. So we're going to go ahead and try live this one of these activities so that we can work through it. All right, so I'm going to walk through this with you the way I would walk through it with a group of students the first time we've done it. That's one of our recommendations is before you have students complete each of the different types of activities, you go through one as a whole class just to help them to see where all the information is, right? I would remind students that their job is to put two sentences together into one sentence, two or more sentences, reminding them that they may have to add or remove or change the form of a word, and then reminding them that there's not just one right answer. I think this is an important detail that is on the first slide of all of our Quill slides, so it's really important to share that with students. And this is the last thing. If you've been using Quill for any amount of time, you know that Quill's real nitpicky about spelling, capitalization, and punctuation. So one of these student strategies that I often ask students to engage in is in their notebook, on a Post-it next to them, wherever, is to write down SPC for spelling, punctuation, and capitalization. So they check that carefully before they enter their answers. It can show up that they haven't learned an entire skill if they go through and they make so many spelling and punctuation errors that they don't get full score on the activity. So we want to encourage students to make sure that they're typing accurately in addition to typing the correct ideas. So I would share that with students in the first slide. Once we get into the activity, there are going to be directions right here on my slide I want to follow. So it'll say things like, I'm combining these sentences into one sentence. Here are my two sentences to combine. Here's where I'm typing my answer, where our answer is going to be just one sentence. So here we go. The International Space Station orbits Earth. The International Space Station is a large spacecraft. All right, let's get this wrong. All right, let's see what Quill tells us. So one of the things that I did here is I misspelled the word Earth, right? So because I misspelled the word Earth, it's hard for Quill to know that I've included all the appropriate details. So if I was working through this with my students, I might include some sort of error to let them know that they should be looking for it. Here's the important part. Even if you don't make this exact error, you will see in orange a hint for what you need to change to make your sentence correct. We've done that deliberately to make sure it really shows up for students, but it always helps to remind them to read those instructions. The next thing here is Quill will also offer hints. So if you look at the bottom of the page here, you can see these books and some hints that will let us know what exactly is expected from us for this activity. The hint once again, or the note once again, the direction, the feedback here is reminding me to look at the hint, but just making sure students know, because occasionally, especially if they're working on a Chromebook, they won't necessarily see the hint at the bottom of the screen the first time they click on it. So let me go ahead and try to get this correct. And there's my strong sentence. It only took me a few attempts. One thing to note for students is that if they attempt it 5 times, Quill is going to push them into a multiple choice answer, but it's not going to tell them which of those exact answers is correct. So what it's asking students to do from that point is to make their best guess and look at some correct sentences like we can see here to make sure that they can do it correctly the next time around. Now, this is another page I would really highlight for your students when you go through a demo with them. And if you're walking around the classroom, this can be an easy thing to prompt them with. So you can see there are 3 different versions of this answer that are showing up for us here. And it's important for students to see that because they can note which sentence they would write if they were to write that sentence again, right? Would I choose my answer again, or would I select a different one of these answers? That's something that every student will think differently about. I've shared this before, I'll share it again. We had a great instance with third graders a while back where there were two different versions of a sentence. The only difference was an exclamation point. And I asked the students what sentence they would choose if they wrote it again. One of the third graders told me I would write it with the exclamation point because it shows emotion. And another third grader would say, I would use a period because bats flying isn't that exciting. So it can be a really great way for students to really start thinking about the choices they make when they write their sentences. Now, we're not going to work all the way through this activity, but the big points here to make to your students are look through and read the instructions or the lesson at the beginning of the activity. Make sure that you're paying attention to the instructions on each page. Check out the feedback on each page and make sure to check out the hints. Okay, so we've looked through an activity itself. Now, on the last page of activities, we have a lessons report. So, like I mentioned earlier, currently students can't retrieve this lessons report after they leave the activity. So, it's super important for students to look at it before they move on. So, if I'm looking at this report right here, I can see right off the bat the areas in which I've succeeded and the areas in which I need a little more work. Right? So the focus of this activity was compound subjects. I have a yellow, which is a decent score, but not a great one yet. And I can see in terms of compound subjects, I did it right a lot of times, but there are still a number of errors that I need to look at. So when I'm looking at this, I'm really thinking about, okay, so I need a little more work in terms of compound subjects. Now, you can also see in terms of capitalization, I have 2 wrong and none right. This doesn't mean I didn't capitalize anything right ever. What this means is I was making some errors when it came to capitalization. So it will be important for you to remind students that when they look at this should really, I mean, they shouldn't have more than 1 or 2 capitalization errors over the course of doing their answers, and the fewer the better. So they can see overall there were what errors they were able to, or what they were able to correct, and what they still need to do better next time. You can have students screenshot this, and then they can either paste them into a document or keep them in a folder, however it is that you would like them to do it. They don't have to copy and paste this. It might not be useful for students to see it after the first time, but when they're returning to try an activity for a second time, this might just be a really good reminder for them. Okay, so once students finish an activity, they'll go back to their dashboard and they're going to see colors that let them know how they have done with those activities. So you can see right here on this student's dashboard, here are a series of different colors. Now, this student's doing pretty well. They don't have any red assignments, but you'll see they have a number of yellow and green assignments. So we try to use the same, I try to use the same language when I speak to every class. Green means great job, right? So you've gotten above an 80%, you've shown mastery. That doesn't mean you don't ever come back to the skill. If you forget how to do it or your teacher notices you're not using a skill correctly, you can always go back and replay that activity just to review it for yourself. Yellow means try again. Right? You're not quite there in terms of mastery. It usually means you've gotten close. Oftentimes it could be that about, partway through the activity, it started to make sense to you. Red, when we talk to students, doesn't mean you failed. It's just an opportunity to stop and ask for help. Now, this is one of the ways we really want students to be opening themselves up to getting your feedback, because it can be a lot to manage, as I'm sure you know in your class, when you have many students working on different activities at the same time. When students see red, that means that they have below a 60%. If you'd like to share that with students, you can. We don't actually share percentages with students in these cases because what we find is students get hung up on the number and don't realize that they have the opportunity to redo things. So the reason we ask students to stop and ask for help when they get to a red is it suggests that there's some sort of misunderstanding or that the directions on Quill aren't making a lot of sense to them. Maybe they're an English language learner and they struggled with the vocabulary. Maybe they just didn't read through very carefully and they need someone to come over and remind them how to read through the activity. Or maybe Quill's explanation didn't make sense to them, in which case they're going to rely on you, their teacher, to help them to understand. When they see these things, If they have a yellow, they should go back and try the activity. They don't have to try it right away, but they should go back and try it again until they get to green. And if they have a red, they should chat with either you or, if you feel comfortable with it, another student before they try it again. Last thing here, the goal for students should be that their entire dashboard shows up green, right? We want them to feel like every single activity is something that they have mastered at some point. So really telling students, I want to see greens all along this page, that should be your goal. So we've talked a lot about what students can do when they're looking at Quill, right? So over the course of the week, you may have students work on one or two Quill activities. I wouldn't recommend having students do more than one or two activities a week because of retention, right? If I'm working on different grammar skills or five different sentence combining skills over the course of a week, chances are I'm not going to be terribly effective at using those skills. So here's where it becomes important for you to go beyond the platform and ask students to apply what they're learning to create their own sentences in their writing. We have a couple suggestions that I'm going to run by you. The first one here that we'll talk through is a glossary of rules, right? So either in a notebook or in a separate document, giving students the opportunity just to transfer the rule that they learned to a place where they can go back to it very quickly and easily. Now, I know a lot of teachers really feel like that can be helpful, this feeling of like, oh, I have it in one place, but I've written it down somewhere else. So I've had to really look through it. Another thing students can do is they can track their strategies and when they've looked for that strategy and other things. And then the last area here is using the strategies that they've learned on Quill to improve and construct stronger sentences overall. So I made this fun little document here you'll see on the side. On one side, you can see what page from Quill I'm looking at, and on the other side, you can see how I have had students write it down. So this page right here was not something we saw in that first activity we did. I can go back to another activity here and show you what that looks like. So what you can see here is the second slide after reminding you what's true for each one of the Quill activities is this is a specific skill we want students to learn. So we're going to give them this quick, it's basically our mini lesson, but it comes in the form of examples. So from here is the skill that students will practice throughout. There's a reason that this isn't incredibly large and robust. Number one is the less text on the page, the more likely it is for the student to read it. And number two is we want students to try it and learn by trying and failing and trying again. So you want to really consider like this is something that students can have as a reference point, but it's not necessarily the end of the world if this doesn't provide every single detail about combining actions, people, and things. So as a student, when I'm looking at this slide, one of the things that my teacher can encourage me to do to make sure that I am thinking about this skill is actually keeping sort of a glossary of that in my notebook. So you can see for my glossary, I included the name of the activity, which actually showed up on my dashboard before I opened the activity. The reason that's helpful is because that means that I can always remember where to go back to if I want to practice this skill again. The name of the skill is right here at the top of this lesson page. Now from here, I haven't written directly what exists here. I have summarized or paraphrased. This is another thing you can walk through with your students. You will have some students that just try to transfer directly the text from this slide to their writing. And it's up to you whether that's something that you want to work with them on or whether it's okay and it's useful to the students to have all of this information with them. One of the other things you can encourage students to do in terms of building their glossary is you'll notice that some of my sentences that I wrote here in my examples are different from the sentences that you'll find in this. And that was a deliberate choice on my part because I wanted to make sure that I understood it. So I was writing my own sentences rather than copying Quill's. It's up to you how you want to relay that information to your students, but that can be super helpful. The next thing after the glossary is actually making sure that students are using these skills to proofread. So here's the point where the screenshot of the end of their lesson really comes in handy. You can see the different skills that they worked on. right, overall, and they can write those skills in their skill tracker, right? So plural nouns was something I was working on. When I looked through my essay, I checked to make sure that my nouns were plural in the right places. Compound subjects was something I looked at. I'm going to make sure that when I have two subjects doing the same thing, that I've written them correctly in the sentence. Subject verb agreements with those plural nouns or those singular nouns, I've made sure that my subject and my verb agree. And then the last thing here is capitalization. Now, I know my experience when I was working with middle school students was things like capitalization were oftentimes sort of scrapped because of like the texting norms, right? So when I'm writing my draft of my essay, it doesn't really matter if I capitalize. The problem, of course, was then that when it came to state exams or final essays, that didn't happen. So having those sorts of things listed here is going to be really helpful to students. Now, this is obviously a really simple document. Really, what I'm hoping for is that students will go through and check off that they have looked for these things in their different pieces of writing, right? And because each student might be working on slightly different skills, it might be tricky for you to go through and look at each individual student's set of skills on each piece of writing. But this is a quick track and quick check, right? I can say, okay, so these are the skills you said you looked for in your writing. I did a spot check for your compound subjects, and it doesn't look like you checked for that at all. I don't see any of that circled or edited, whatever else. So here, students are doing that first round through to make it a little bit easier for you when it comes time for you to look for specific skills. The next step here is obviously with the checklist, you have to actually proofread your paper. So once they write their essay, having a form where students are circling the things they got wrong and pulling it out and rewriting the sentence or correcting that thing as they go, these are the ways that we really want students looking at their work. So we've got the proofreading for their own paper and then also for other papers. Now, Quill also has a series of proofreading activities. This is actually, I've copied and pasted the text from one of them here. So Quill has these activities, and you can have students use those to practice those proofreading skills before they start looking at their writing or other folks' writing. And then the last thing, and this is the one that I think is really important if we're thinking about our Bloom's taxonomy in terms of the rigor of what we're working on, and this is actually writing new sentences. So once again, I have the same list of skills that I had from my checklist, the same sorts of things that I was proofreading for, and now I can think creatively about examples for these different things. Now, these examples can be things that I create on the spot. These examples can be things that when I'm reading through my essay, I go, oh, I really did a really beautiful sentence with compound subjects there. And then the more complex they get, maybe they write a sentence in Quill on when they're doing an activity that they're really proud of, right? Maybe they write a sentence that's correct but unique, right? So they write a sentence that isn't the same as any of the top 3 answers on Quill. They might write that sentence down. So this is a great way for them to say, I can see this skill in this sentence, and I created this sentence for people to see. These will be really fun things for students to share with one another, right? Here's Tom's example of compound subjects. Here's Tyreek's example of plural nouns. These different sort of things can be super duper helpful. So these are just a couple different ways. Probably adopting all of them won't be the most helpful, but picking one to really help students to think through how they can engage with Quill outside of the platform are going to be super duper helpful. So how can you support students in really applying these things, driving their own learning on Quill? One of the ways to do that is we have an activity scores report on Quill, which basically ends up looking like a progress report. So if I'm looking at a certain student for activity scores, let me go ahead and log into an admin account here. I can print out the reports and share those with the students. So if I look at my activity scores, I select a student. I can see here are all of the activities that Albert has worked on, when he worked on them, what his last score was on the activity, And then over here, these are our colors. Now, this can be helpful if, say, you have a student who maybe has a lot of greens, but it's like a lot of 86s, or you have that one kid who wants to make sure they have a 100 on every assignment. You can print out this progress report and they can aim for a 100. They can also tell if they have a 100, if they're coming and bugging you all the time. If they actually look at the slide that shows their score at the end, if you have any reds, you don't have a 100. Just a quick thing to remind them of, because there are always those students who are going to make sure they got a perfect score on everything. But what can be really nice about this is now I have a specific list of things that I'm looking for, right? So these are all commonly confused words. I'm going to read through my essay and make sure that I've gotten all of these things correct as I've gone. So this can be a report that you can print and share with students that may be helpful to them as you go. Another thing that I've seen a lot of teachers do successfully, and let me tell you, I had wild success using trackers with my 11th graders and with my 3rd graders, so you can see where this can be helpful, is to allow students to track those skills themselves in public. It can either be having their own one of these that they put up on the wall that shows each of their individual skills, or you can select certain skills that everyone in the class is working on, say, capitalizing proper nouns, and you can make that a skill that every student will get a score for. Now, one fun way that I've seen this done is you can do stickers, and those stickers you can have the red face, the yellow face, and the green face, or the red dot, yellow dot, green dot. And as students get closer to mastery, they get a dot no matter what if they complete the activity, and then you can cover that dot until they get to green. So the goal here is for students to be able to see green across the board and encourage one another. The last way is just what I showed you earlier on. We have 3 different types of independent activities. Our grammar activities, which is anytime you see the puzzle piece, our proofreader activities, which is anytime you see the flag, and our target activities. When you are in your teacher account, you can go through and preview any of the activities. I recommend working through a preview of the activity with your whole class before you have them work on any of them on their own. Older students, most students in general, are able to do the quill activities effectively without them, but it also can be really helpful. And if it's something that will really help students to do their best work on quill from the beginning, it might be worth taking that time before they get into the full swing of things with quill. All right, so at this point, I am going to stop the recording and open it up to feedback. I'm going to leave this slide open in front of you because we have a link here to our survey. The link here is going to take you straight to a survey. It'll probably take you about 5 minutes to complete because it not only has questions about what you thought of the way we presented things today, but it also is going to have some questions about things like, when's the best time of day for you? What sort of topics would you like us to focus on in the future, etc. So those are the sorts of things you can do.